Hey friends, I want to welcome you back to Midweek as we continue through our series, Building Bridges, where we're simply just taking snippets of the book of Proverbs, some practical advice throughout the book of Proverbs that's helping us engage and create better relationships, building bridges with different cultures, different religions, different worldviews, different ideologies, and hopefully bridging the gap between them and Jesus, because that is what God has called us to do. Remember what Jesus says in Matthew 28, go into all of the world and make disciples. But we can't do that if we don't know how to effectively engage in conversations with them. We can't do that if we don't build relationships with them. And so last week we talked about the first question that you should engage in when you have an introductory conversation. And that's simply, what does that person believe? And we looked at Proverbs 18:13, where it says, if anyone gives an answer before he hears, it's his folly and his shame, right? So what he's saying is that if we just take a moment to discover what it is that they believe, ask the question, and then just simply shut down and just listen to what they say, you're going to gather a lot of evidence. And so that's going to move on to today. We're going to piggyback off that idea and ask the second question, which is, why do they believe what they believe? Why have they landed on this conviction? Why do they feel like this is the truth, right? What's convicting them? What brought them to that conclusion? And we get this from Proverbs 16:25. And here's what it says. It says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. Which means that there are plenty of ideas out there where people are trying to convince you and sway you that this is the right truth, that this is the conviction you should hold. The problem is there's only one truth, as we know as Christians. Jesus says it himself in John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through me. What Jesus is saying is that there is no eternity outside of me for anybody, right? So whatever truth you land on, if it's not Jesus, it's not going to lead well. It leads to death, as Proverbs says. So what we want to do as we build these bridges is to hopefully pull them out of that and lead them to a relationship with Jesus. But that starts with us building relationships with them. In fact, this was the whole idea that Jesus has created. I mean, look at the life of Christ. Right? He didn't even start his ministry until he was around 30 years old. That means all those 30 years of him growing up, being a teenager, being a young adult, all he did was focus on building relationships. He didn't walk up to everybody when he was 12 and say, I am the Son of God. I mean, he preached in a temple, but he didn't go and try to show people exactly who he was at the very moment he engaged with people. Jesus was a master at building relationships, and he gathered information. He gathered insights from them. He looked at their worldview, the gods that they worship from all cultures, from the Greeks to the Romans to the Jews to all the Gentiles and everything in between. Jesus was an expert at meeting people where they were and asking the why question. Why have you concluded what you conclude? And then he just goes after them with a fierce pursuit and leads them back to himself. Jesus was a great example of what we need to do. And I remember, with this idea in mind, as I'm going through my master's program, I took a class on Islam. And I really wanted to engage in this class because as the prison chaplain, Islam is a big community within our purview here, as Christianity is as well. And so I wanted to be able to engage with some of the Muslim inmates a little bit better. And so one of the assignments that we had for my class on Islam is to interview different Muslims. Now, this was kind of challenging because as I live in this smaller community, we're not really full of different religions and different ideologies and different cultures. I mean, we're kind of stuck into our small window of what we have here. And so I called the Islamic Center of Quincy. I called the Islamic Center in Macomb, and I even interviewed some of the inmates that I serve at the prison. And as I had to interview them, the simple task was this, is just gather information and write a report on what you've learned. That's it. There was no strings attached. There was no debates. There was no me trying to win them over to Jesus. And as the professor kind of led us into this assignment, what he was trying to get us to do is to simply build relationships. Discover the why. Why do they hold these convictions? And so in this assignment, I would ask questions like, when did you start to think Islam was right for you? And what was it about Islam that you conclude that this is the truth, that this is the way to go? Who were some influential people that led you down this path? Most of the time it was they grew up in Islam or they had a family member who was Islamic, but I was interested in learning about who they were, their upbringing, what drew them to this conclusions. I even asked them what books they read, what movies, what other media should I look to if I really want to fully engage in learning about Islamic culture. And to my surprise, almost everything that validates Islam is written by Islamic scholars. So there's nothing outside of Islam that really says Islam is the truth. But I learned all these things as I went in to have these conversations with them. What I took away was this was about building relationships. I didn't walk away there changing my ideas or my theology. They didn't change their convictions. We all came to the table with them and we all left with the same conclusions, but what we left with was so much greater than what we came with. And that was deeper friendships, deeper relationships. I spent hours talking to these guys, diving into their faith. They asked questions about me, and never once did it ever feel like a debate. It all felt friendly. It all felt welcoming because I was searching for the why. I already knew the what. Now I was searching for the why they landed there. When you ever take time to dive into someone's world and you simply ask them about their life, they are always willing to unfold that information if you act or if you are sincere in gathering that information. Because you guys have talked to people before where they may ask you a question, but they're genuinely not, they don't care what your answer is. Kind of like when we pass and we say, hey, how you doing? Nobody ever sits there for 5 minutes and explains legitimately how they're doing. It's just a common phrase that we say in order to make the passing not as uncomfortable as it usually can be. But when you actually sit down and you make eye contact with somebody and you fully are engaged with their answers and you're studying who they are and you are just kind of embracing their culture as they unfold this to you, even if you don't land on the same convictions, they feel loved by you. And at the end of the day, you walk away with friendships. And as those relationships build over time, you have become, as I've said many times last year, a pebble in their shoe. And so what I did is I gathered the information by asking the why they land on this conclusion, why they have these convictions. And I started making some small parallels between Christianity and Islam. And I started finding paths that I can start navigating discussions that are going to lead them to the gospel of Jesus, hopefully, as I start to take the Quran and I compare little segments of the truth of the gospel, as I start to see what they believe about Allah and make small changes to who the God of the Bible is and start engaging in those conversations just one day at a time. Remember, we don't want to flood them with anything, but what you can do is you can start planning your offensive play. Right? You take the information, you say, okay, how can I use the gospel and how can I interject it into this conversation now that I know where we're heading? And that's exactly what Jesus teaches us to do. Remember, it took him 30 years to build some of the relationships he's had. Jesus was an expert at just listening and gathering the information. And I think if we do this well, we're going to walk away with a lot more friendships. And what brings people to church isn't a great sermon. It's not the great music. It's not the great light show and the smoke show. It's relationships. Relationships are what bring people to Jesus, which is why when he says the Great Commission to go into all the world and make disciples, what Jesus is saying is go make valuable relationships that are going to transcend from this life all the way to the next. Bring them to me. Build that bridge back to Jesus. That's what building bridges is all about. Friends, as we continue through this series, I hope that you're feeling the convictions that I do. I hope that you are finding yourself in moments where you go, who's the next person that I can start building relationships to? And I'll even go further to say this, who's the next person that you know right now that you can invite to church this Sunday? Friends, don't just sit on these convictions. Play out and watch what God does as we continue to build bridges together. We'll see you next week.